Neil Young was the conscience of rock and roll, a songwriter who turned protest into poetry and made rebellion sound like religion. For decades, he stood apart from the crowd, a lone voice who never played by the industry's rules. Today, we're uncovering the clashes that forged his legacy, the feuds that defined Neil Young, and the three stories he'll never forget. In 1983, Neil Young was sued by his own record label, not for breaking a contract, but for making music that was unrepresentative and not commercial. Geffen Records, the label that had promised him complete creative freedom, accused him of violating his own identity. It was one of the strangest lawsuits in music history. A label suing an artist for sounding too much like himself, and yet not enough. Just a year earlier, David Geffen had personally signed Neil to his new label, pitching Geffen Records as a safe haven for artists who wanted to experiment. Neil had just come off a decade of hits, Harvest, After the Gold Rush, Tonight's the Night, and fans expected more of the same. Geffen did too. But Neil had no interest in repeating himself. His first album for the label, Trans, 1982, blindsided everyone. Instead of warm folk rock, it was full of synthesizers, vocoders, and robotic vocals. It sounded like Kraftwerk in a cowboy hat. Fans were confused, critics were divided, and Geffen executives panicked. What they didn't know was that Trans came from something deeply personal. Neil's son Ben was born with cerebral palsy and couldn't speak. The mechanical voices were Neil's way of exploring communication and isolation. To him, the album wasn't weird. It was honest. Geffen didn't see it that way. They wanted another Harvest. Instead, Neil delivered a cyberpunk concept album. And when that flopped, he made things even worse. At least from their perspective. His next record, Everybody's Rockin' 1983, was a tongue-in-cheek rockabilly throwback. It was short, silly, and full of doo-wop rhythms. Neil posed on the cover in a pink suit, smirking like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The label called it a joke. Neil called it a statement. David Geffen was furious. He'd given Neil one of the most lucrative artist contracts of the era, and now the label's new star was handing in what sounded like parody records. So, Geffen sued. The complaint claimed Neil's recent albums were not characteristic of his past work and thus breached the agreement. It was a bizarre accusation, as if the label owned not just his music, but his identity. Neil fought back hard. He countersued, arguing that his contract guaranteed him full creative control. They didn't like Trans because it wasn't Harvest, he later said. But if I make Harvest 2, they'll say I'm repeating myself. I can't win. The case instantly made headlines. Rolling Stone called it the most ironic lawsuit in rock history. Artists and fans rallied behind Neil, seeing him as the symbol of creative independence. Here was a man who'd built his career on unpredictability, now punished for being exactly that. As the dispute dragged on, Geffen's reputation began to crack. The man who'd once branded himself as the artist's ally was suddenly the villain. He tried to justify the lawsuit as business, but the optics were terrible. By 1985, realizing the damage, Geffen personally called Neil to apologize. The lawsuit was dropped. Neil was free. The whole debacle left its mark. Trans and Everybody's Rockin' were commercial flops, but over time, critics reevaluated them as bold and misunderstood. The so-called lost Geffen years became proof that Neil Young refused to chase trends. He made the music he needed to make, even if no one else got it. Years later, Neil joked, "They wanted hits. I gave them history." It was his way of saying he'd won on his own terms. By the late 80s, he returned to Reprise Records and released Freedom 1989, complete with Rockin' in the Free World, a thunderous anthem that reignited his career and reminded the world why you don't tell Neil Young what to do. The Geffen War wasn't just about one lawsuit. It was about control, who owns an artist's voice, and what happens when commerce tries to dictate creativity. Neil Young made sure everyone knew the answer. But his next feud wouldn't take place in a courtroom. It would unfold in the lyrics of two classic rock songs, a musical crossfire that split America right down the middle. One of rock's most famous musical feuds, Neil Young versus Lynyrd Skynyrd. It wasn't fought in tabloids or on-stage meltdowns. It was fought through songs, microphones, and the clash of two very different Americas in the early 1970s. Neil Young had never been shy about politics. By 1970, after Ohio captured the fury of a generation mourning the Kent State shootings, he had established himself as rock's conscience, the one who would say what others wouldn't. But his next statement would hit closer to home. In 1970, he released Southern Man, a haunting track from his album After the Gold Rush. It wasn't just a song, it was an indictment. Over distorted guitars and gospel-like backing vocals, Neil painted the American South as a land still haunted by racism and violence. "Southern man, better keep your head," he sang. "Don't forget what your good book said." It was blunt, angry, and unflinching. A protest song that didn't pull punches. 2 years later, he followed it up with Alabama on his 1972 album Harvest. If Southern Man was the spark, Alabama was the flame. This time, Neil addressed the state by name, calling out its white mansions and ghosts of the past. It wasn't subtle. To Neil, these were not attacks on people, but on systems, the lingering racism that the civil rights movement had yet to bury. But to many Southerners, including a rising band from Jacksonville, Florida, it felt personal. Lynyrd Skynyrd was the voice of the New South, proud, defiant, and determined to prove that the region was more than its worst stereotypes. By 1973, the band was gaining momentum with a swaggering sound that blended blues, rock, and country. Their frontman, Ronnie Van Zant, was charismatic, sharp, and fiercely protective of his roots. He admired Neil Young as a songwriter, but he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Neil, take shots at his home without answering back. And so came Sweet Home Alabama. Released in 1974, the song was an instant anthem, bright, confident, and unapologetically Southern. And right there in the second verse came the line that would ignite one of rock's most famous exchanges. "I hope Neil Young will remember, a Southern man don't need him around anyhow." It was bold, and it made headlines immediately. The line wasn't just a clapback, it was a cultural statement. In the middle of post-Vietnam, post-civil rights America, Sweet Home Alabama felt like the South standing up and saying, "You don't define us." The media loved the drama. "Feud between rock titans," screamed headlines. But in truth, the story was far more nuanced. Ronnie Van Zant wasn't angry. He was amused. In interviews, he called Neil a great songwriter and said Sweet Home Alabama was meant as a friendly rebuttal, not a grudge. "We thought Neil went a little too hard on the South," he told Rolling Stone, "so we said our piece." And Neil? He took it just as lightly. When asked about the lyric, he smiled and said, "They're right. I deserved it." He even admitted that Sweet Home Alabama was a great song. In fact, there was mutual respect between them that few people realized. Neil and Ronnie had talked about collaborating. Van Zant even wore a Neil Young t-shirt on the cover photo sessions for Street Survivors. Neil later revealed he had sent Ronnie a demo of a song he was working on, Powderfinger. Ronnie never got the chance to record it. Tragically, in October 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd's plane crashed en route to Baton Rouge, killing Ronnie Van Zant and several others. When Neil heard the news, he was devastated. That night, he performed Alabama in concert and dedicated it to Ronnie. For all the headlines about rivalry, The truth was that it had been a dialogue, one built on respect. Years later, Neil reflected on it in his memoir. "Sweet Home Alabama struck me as ironic in its own way," he wrote. "I think Ronnie and I were basically saying the same thing, that the South is a complex place, capable of change." The so-called feud became a symbol of something much larger than either artist. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about how art mirrored a divided country. Neil's songs held up a mirror to America's conscience, and Skynyrd's answered back with pride and defiance. Two artists, two sides of the same truth, and maybe that's why the story still resonates. In an era where music often avoids controversy, Neil Young and Lynyrd Skynyrd showed that disagreement could spark conversation, not division. They didn't cancel each other, they challenged each other. Today, when Sweet Home Alabama plays on the radio, it's often heard as a feel-good anthem. But buried in those cheerful guitar licks is a snapshot of one of rock's most fascinating debates, one that captured the tension, pride, and contradictions of 1970s America. And for Neil Young, it was another lesson in how honesty comes with a price. His words sparked outrage, but also dialogue. He didn't apologize for starting the fire, because that's what his music was meant to do. As he would later say in an interview, "You can love a place and still question it. That's what real love is." But Neil's battles didn't end with history or heritage. Decades later, his fight for authenticity would take on a new enemy, not a musician or a label, but an entire digital empire. And this time, the war would play out in the streaming age. This wasn't a courtroom battle or a public takedown. It was something quieter, more painful. A friendship that collapsed under the weight of ego, honesty, and time. Neil Young and David Crosby weren't just bandmates. For years, they were brothers in song, bound by harmony and vision. Together, with Stephen Stills and Graham Nash, they formed one of the most celebrated supergroups of the 1970s. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Their voices blended like magic, but behind that perfect harmony lived chaos. From the outside, CSNY looked unstoppable. Their performances defined a generation. Songs like Ohio and Helpless became anthems of protest and reflection. But inside the group, tempers burned hotter than amplifiers. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young all had strong personalities, and Neil, ever the loner, didn't play well with compromise. He would show up to rehearsals late, cancel tours without notice, and sometimes disappear for months without telling anyone. The others called it erratic. Neil called it necessary. Crosby once said, "Neil's got his own rules, always has." But those rules often left wreckage behind. During the mid-70s, while the band was trying to record Long May You Run, Neil abruptly left the project halfway through, taking half the songs with him and erasing Crosby and Nash's parts from the tapes. For most musicians, that would end the friendship right there. For CSNY, it was just another Tuesday. They reunited, broke up, and reunited again, a pattern that became their curse. Every comeback looked promising, and every breakdown was messier than the last. Crosby, the outspoken idealist, wanted unity and order. Neil, the wanderer, wanted space. Their visions clashed every time they tried to coexist, but things finally reached the point of no return in 2014. That year, David Crosby made a remark that would burn the last bridge standing. In an interview, he called Neil's then-partner Daryl Hannah a purely poisonous predator, implying that she had broken up Neil's marriage. It was a cruel comment, and Neil didn't take it lightly. When asked about it, Neil was blunt. "Crosby's not a part of my life anymore," he said. "That's the way it is." From that moment, the brotherhood was over. There would be no more reunions, no more reconciliation tours. Crosby later admitted regret, telling The Guardian, "I said something stupid. I apologized. Neil's very smart, and I hurt him deeply." But Neil never went back. In 2021, Crosby said in an interview, "Neil's probably the most selfish person I know." It wasn't said with venom, but with the exhaustion of someone who had finally accepted defeat. He added, "I still love him. I just can't reach him." Neil, as usual, stayed silent. He rarely comments on personal conflicts, preferring to let time and music do the talking. But when David Crosby passed away in January 2023, Neil broke that silence. On his website, he wrote a short tribute. David was a very supportive friend in the early days. His voice and energy were at the heart of so many things. He leaves behind a great legacy in music that will last forever. It was a quiet, graceful acknowledgement, not forgiveness, but respect. For all their differences, Neil still recognized the bond they once shared. Their story isn't just about hurt feelings. It's about how fragile creative brotherhoods can be. CSNY made music that spoke to generations, but behind the scenes, the same passion that fueled their genius also tore them apart. David Crosby and Neil Young represented two sides of the same truth: the dreamer and the drifter, the idealist and the outlaw. Together, they made history. Apart, they reminded the world that even legends can't escape being human. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that their friendship ended, but that it couldn't survive the same fire that made their music timeless. Because for Neil Young, walking away has always been part of his story. Whether it was a record label, a band, or a lifelong friend, when something no longer felt true, he left. And while most people would call that cold, Neil would just call it honest. After all, in his world, truth was the only thing worth keeping. And perhaps that's why he endures. Because in an age where image often outweighs substance, Neil Young remains the rare artist who refuses to compromise. His feuds weren't tantrums, they were declarations of independence. Every conflict, from Geffen to Skynyrd to Spotify, carved out his identity as rock's last purist. Today, when you hear his voice, rough, imperfect, real, it carries the weight of every stand he ever took. Every word, every note, every protest still vibrates with conviction. So here's the question: was Neil Young stubborn, or was he simply the last one brave enough to never back down?